The heavy silver teapot caught the summer light as Victoria Hayes lifted it, and every guest on the terrace of Thornfield House leaned forward to watch the woman they all called the mistress of the estate pour the ceremonial tea. Steam curled up in a thin ribbon, carrying the bright bergamot smell of Earl Grey across the sunlit stone. 200 miles of blue Atlantic glittered below the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, and beneath the striped awning 40 of the region's wealthiest families sat in white linen, fanning themselves against the July heat, waiting for the moment Victoria would be formally welcomed as the future lady of the Whitmore fortune. She smiled her practiced, radiant smile, tilted the pot, and let the amber tea fall into the delicate porcelain cup she was about to offer the family's 80-year-old matriarch, never once imagining that the quiet young woman she had ordered to stand by the servant's door, in a plain gray dress with tea stains on her sleeve, was the only person on that terrace who legally belonged to the family at all. Clara Bennett watched the ribbon of steam and said nothing. Her hands, folded in front of her, did not tremble, though a wave of quiet, aching humiliation moved through her like the tide below. She had polished that silver pot herself at 6 that morning. She had cut the jasmine that scented the air. And in exactly 4 minutes, on that same terrace, an 80-year-old woman's wrinkled hand would move faster than anyone believed possible, and a porcelain cup would shatter on the stones, and a single word would end everything. To understand how it came to that, we have to go back 5 months, to the morning Victoria Hayes first walked through the front doors of Thornfield House as though she already owned them. Clara Bennett was 27 years old, and for 14 months she had risen before the sun. She was a trained nurse, though almost no one at Thornfield remembered that anymore. And she had come to the great gray shingled house on the cliffs to care for Margaret Whitmore, the matriarch, whose heart had grown tired and whose knees no longer trusted the stairs. Clara knew the exact rhythm of the old woman's mornings. The 2 blue pills at 7, the warm lemon water, the slow walk to the east window where the light came in gold off the water and Margaret liked to name the sailboats. She knew that the old woman's hands ached in the damp, and that a warm cloth pressed to them for exactly 90 seconds made her sigh with relief. She knew the sound of Margaret's cane on the oak floor, the particular creak of the 3rd stair, the way the salt wind rattled the east shutters at dawn. She kept all of it, every dose and every small comfort, in a worn blue notebook she carried in her apron pocket. She did not know yet that the little blue notebook would one day matter more than every dollar the Whitmores owned. What almost no one in the house knew was that Clara was not the hired help at all. 14 months earlier, in a small stone chapel outside Boston, with 2 witnesses and a borrowed bouquet of white peonies, Clara had married Daniel Whitmore, the matriarch's grandson and the sole heir to the family's shipping company. It had been quiet by choice. Daniel had wanted to shield her from his mother's cold, calculating scrutiny until the family could learn to love her as he did. Then a crisis at the company's Singapore office had pulled him overseas for what was meant to be 6 weeks. 6 weeks had become 5 long months. And into the space he left behind, like water finding a crack, had come Victoria. Victoria Hayes was 31, poised and precise as a blade. She had arrived as a supposed friend of Daniel's mother, Patricia, a charming, elegant woman with an interior design business and a great many opinions about how the estate should be run. Within days she had made herself indispensable to Patricia, who had never approved of her son's secret bride. Within 2 weeks Victoria had begun referring to the house as ours. And in 100 small, deniable ways, she had begun to rewrite the story of who Clara Bennett was. The girl? Clara heard Victoria say once to a visiting cousin, her voice warm as honey and cold as glass. "Oh, she's the caregiver. Sweet thing. A little familiar with the family, but you know how these arrangements can be." And she had laughed, a light silver laugh, and the cousin had nodded, and just like that, in one sentence, 14 months of devotion had been reduced to a servant's presumption. The cruelty was rarely loud. That was its genius. It came dressed as concern, as etiquette, as the gentle correction of a woman who only wanted the best for a great old house. At the long dinner table one evening in early July, with candlelight glancing off the crystal and the silver, Victoria had waited until the soup was served before she turned her lovely head toward Clara, who stood by the sideboard. "Would the girl mind eating in the kitchen tonight?" she had asked Patricia, in a voice pitched to Carrie. "It's only that the Ashfords are joining us, and it does look peculiar, doesn't it, to seat the help among the family? People notice these things." Of course, Patricia had answered, without so much as a glance. She prefers the kitchen anyway. "Don't you, dear?" Clara had gathered her plate and gone, the smell of rosemary and roasting lamb following her down the servants' hall into the warm kitchen, where the copper pots hung gleaming, and Rosa waited with 2 clean forks and a small, fierce loyalty. And behind her, at the candlelit table, Victoria had smiled into her wine, entirely certain that another brick had been laid in a wall the little nurse would never climb. Patricia Whitmore, 62 and immaculate in her pearls, had been delighted to help the erasure along. She had never once used Clara's married name. On the morning, Victoria proposed the great summer garden party, the party where, she announced, the family would at last make things official between herself and Daniel. Patricia had turned to Clara in front of the entire staff and thrust a stained apron into her hands. "You'll serve, of course," Patricia had said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "You do know the china. And do try to keep out of the photographs, dear. It confuses people." Clara had taken the apron. She had folded it over her arm and said, in a voice that did not shake, of course, Mrs. Whitmore, because she had learned in 14 months that the loudest answer to cruelty was often a steady voice, and because she was waiting. She did not yet know for what, but something in her, patient and bright as a banked fire, refused to burn out. There was one person in that vast house, besides the matriarch, who saw Clara clearly. Her name was Rosa Delgado, and she was 23, a young housekeeper who had come from a hard year and 30 one-job rejections before Clara had quietly recommended her for the position. Rosa had never forgotten it. It was Rosa who slipped a warm roll and a cup of good coffee onto the windowsill for Clara on the mornings she was banished from the table. It was Rosa who, on the day of the apron, found Clara alone in the pantry with the smell of lemon polish sharp in the air, and squeezed her hand and whispered, "They don't see you." But some of us do. Clara had held on to those 7 words like a stone in a rising current. Remember Rosa. Everything that was owed came back around, in the end. There was one afternoon, though, when Clara nearly broke, and it was Victoria who arranged it. Clara had come upon her in the front hall, sorting the day's post at the marble console, and had seen, plain as noon, an envelope in Daniel's slanting hand slide from the pile into the pocket of Victoria's linen jacket. "Those are my husband's letters," Clara said, before she could stop herself. It was the first time she had claimed him aloud in that house, and the word husband rang in the cold marble air. Victoria did not so much as flinch. She turned, unhurried, and studied Clara the way one studies a stain on good carpet. "Careful, dear," she said, her voice soft and terrible. "You've been under a great deal of strain. A woman in your position, imagining things, saying things, it could look like instability. And an unstable caregiver alone with a frail old woman and her medicines? That's the kind of thing a family has to remove, for everyone's safety. She smiled. Go polish the silver. And do wash your face. You look feverish. Clara went. But that night she wrote 3 lines in the blue notebook, small and even, dated and timed, the envelope, the pocket, the threat. She did not know it yet, but she had just begun to build the case that would one day empty this house of its thieves. The person who saw Clara most clearly of all, however, was Margaret Whitmore herself. The matriarch was 80 years old, with eyes that had watched 80 summers roll in off that same gray water, and there was very little those eyes had not learned to read. She had said nothing, at first, when Victoria began her campaign. She had let the woman pour her tea and plump her cushions and call her darling Margaret in that syrup-sweet voice. But Margaret had noticed things. She had noticed that it was Clara who remembered the 90 seconds of the warm cloth, and Victoria who never once asked how she slept. She had noticed the tea stains that appeared on Clara's sleeves only after Victoria passed through a room. And she had noticed, most of all, the small ledger of the household accounts, because Margaret Whitmore, whatever her tired heart, had run the Whitmore holdings for 30 years, and she still owned, outright and in her own name, 51% of everything the family touched. 3 days before the garden party, Margaret called Clara to the east window in the gold morning light. "Sit," the old woman said. "You've stood long enough for people who don't deserve to see you stand." Clara sat. Margaret studied her a long moment, and then she said something that made the young woman's throat close. "I know who you are, child. I have known since the spring." She reached into the folds of her shawl and drew out a photograph, a small, faded picture of a stone chapel and 2 young people laughing under a rain of peony petals. "My grandson sent me this, before that woman started intercepting my post." The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere below, a gull cried over the water. "He sent letters," Margaret went on, her voice steady and dry. "Every week. They stopped reaching me in April. And the letters I sent him, the ones I gave to Victoria to post, because these old hands can't manage the drive to town. I begin to wonder if a single one ever left this house." She folded Clara's cold hand into both of her warm, aching ones. "I have watched you love this family that has done nothing to earn it. I want you to know that whatever happens at that ridiculous party, you are not alone in this house. Not anymore." It was the first kindness Clara had received in 5 months that came from someone with the power to change things, and it broke something loose in her, not tears, but resolve. "I don't want the money, grandmother," she said quietly. "I never came for the money. I came for you. And I'll go on caring for you whether they ever say my name or not." Margaret's ancient eyes gleamed. "I know that too," she said. "That is precisely why the money will find you anyway. It always does. In the end, when you stop chasing it." She patted Clara's hand. "Now, bring me the household ledger and that little blue book you're always scribbling in. I want to compare some numbers before I'm too old to add." What Margaret found in the numbers turned the morning cold. For 14 months, Clara's blue notebook had recorded medications and, in the 5 months since Victoria's arrival, money, too, because Victoria, in her confidence, had taken to handing Clara documents to witness and file, trusting that the little caregiver neither read nor understood them. Clara, the trained nurse who had once balanced a hospital ward's supply budget to the dollar, had read every one. And she had copied, in her small even hand, the figures that did not add up. A transfer of $42,000 from the Whitmore Caregiving Trust to a vendor no one could name. A second of $60,000 to a design consultancy registered 3 days after Victoria's arrival. Signatures, Margaret's signatures. On authorizations, Margaret swore on her late husband's memory she had never seen. "That is not my hand," the old woman said, her finger trembling over a looping signature. "Close, very close. But the M is wrong. I have signed my name 80 years, child. I know my own M." She sat back, and for the first time Clara saw not the frail matriarch, but the woman who had run an empire. "She has been forging me, draining the trust my late husband built to care for the people who served this family, robbing the maid's pensions and the gardener's fund to buy her own way into my grandson's name." Her finger went still on the page, and her jaw set like old iron. "Well, we shall see about that." 2 floors below, in the cool green study that smelled of leather and old money, Victoria Hayes was, at that very moment, entirely convinced that she had won. She stood before the tall gilt mirror practicing the tilt of the teapot, the gracious incline of her head. She had spent 5 months building this, brick by careful brick, the whispered word, the intercepted letter, the forged message she had sent from Clara's own account to Daniel in Singapore. 3 lines that had shattered a marriage across 9,000 miles. "I've taken what I'm owed, and I'm gone. Don't look for me." She had watched Daniel's replies grow shorter, colder, then stop. She had a folder of contracts ready for Margaret to sign at the party, in front of witnesses too polite to object, that would name her the estate's official administrator. All that remained was the tea. In 3 days she would pour it, the old woman would drink to her health before 40 guests, and the last door would close behind her. She smoothed the ivory silk over her hip and smiled at her reflection. She did not hear the knock, 2 floors up, of a story turning over. Because on the morning of the 2nd day, a man got off a plane at Logan Airport in Boston with 5 months of silence in his chest, and a single question he had crossed the world to ask. Daniel Whitmore had not stopped loving his wife. He had only stopped understanding her, or the ghost of her, that a forged message had left in her place. For 5 months he had told himself that the woman he married had walked away with a portion of the company's money and a note that read like a stranger's. He had thrown himself into the Singapore crisis to keep from feeling it. And then, 4 days earlier, a wire transfer had crossed his desk at the company, a transfer out of the Whitmore Caregiving Trust, authorized by his grandmother's shaky hand that his grandmother, when he finally reached her by telephone through a number Victoria did not control, insisted she had never signed. One thread, pulled, and the whole false tapestry had begun to unravel in his hands. He came home quietly. He did not call the house. He drove the coastal road with the windows down and the summer wind smelling of salt and cut grass and warm asphalt, and he stopped first, not at Thornfield, but at the small law office in town where the family's old attorney, Thomas Foster, had kept the Whitmore secrets for 40 years. "I wondered when you'd come," Thomas said, rising from behind a desk stacked with folders. He was 70, silver-haired, and precise. "Your grandmother telephoned me a week ago. From the gardener's cottage, if you can believe it, because she no longer trusts the phones in her own house." He gestured Daniel into a chair. "Sit down, son. There is a great deal you don't know, and some of it your wife has been quietly documenting for over a year without ever once asking for a thing in return." Daniel sat slowly. "The message she sent me," he said, "in February, telling me she'd gone." "Read it again in your mind," Thomas said gently, "and ask yourself if a single word of it sounded like the woman you married in that chapel. Then ask yourself who profits if you believe it." He slid a folder across the desk. Your grandmother did the arithmetic 3 days ago. I've been doing the law ever since. By this evening, I will have certified copies of every forged authorization. By tomorrow morning, they will be filed. All that remains, Daniel, is whether you will stand on that terrace and say your wife's name out loud, or let another man's lie keep speaking it for you. Daniel looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he opened it, and his knuckles whitened. And something old and cold went out of his face, and something like fury came into it. A clean, quiet fury. The kind that does not shout because it does not need to. That night, in the gardener's cottage at the far edge of the estate, with the windows open to the sound of crickets and the far hush of surf, 4 people sat around a small kitchen table: Margaret, Clara, Thomas Foster, and Walter Cole, the estate manager who had served the family for 38 years and had watched Victoria's arrival with a stone in his stomach. On the scrubbed pine table between them lay the blue notebook, a stack of bank statements, a folder of forged authorizations, and a slim gray flash drive that Walter set down last, with the care of a man laying down a weight he had carried too long. The cameras, Walter said, in the study and the main hall. Miss Hayes had them switched off in April. She did not know I keep a second recorder in the pantry, the old system, from before her time. He tapped the flash drive with one blunt finger. It runs on tape, and it never stopped. She's on it. Every letter she took from the hall table, every signature she practiced at the desk. And a conversation 3 weeks ago with Mrs. Patricia that I think you had all better hear. They played it. The recording was grainy, the voices tinny, but the words were unmistakable. Victoria's cool, amused voice explaining to Patricia exactly how the trust would be emptied and retitled, and Patricia's answering laugh, and the sentence that made Daniel's jaw go white: "The little nurse won't say a word." Girls like that are grateful just to be allowed in the room. Clara reached out and turned it off. In the silence, Daniel looked at her, truly looked at her, his wife, in her plain gray dress with the tea stains on her sleeve, sitting straight-backed in a gardener's kitchen with a year of quiet dignity in her eyes, and something in his face came apart and then, slowly, put itself back together. "I got a message," he said, his voice rough. "In February. From your account." "It said, I know what it said," Clara answered softly. "I read the copy an hour ago. I never wrote it, Daniel." She did not move toward him. She only held his gaze across the lamplight. "I have been here every single day. I bathed your grandmother's hands. I named the sailboats with her. I never left." "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know that now." He reached across the little table, past the notebook and the forged papers and the drive that held 5 months of theft, and he took her stained hand in both of his, and neither of them said anything at all, because the crickets and the surf said it well enough. Margaret Whitmore watched the two of them, and her tired old heart lifted, and she said, in the dry, plain voice of a woman who had seen 80 years of storms and outlasted every one, "Well, I am 80 years old, and I can still tell the difference between a person who loves you and a person who loves your address. That is the only wisdom you ever really need, children. The rest is just arithmetic." She reached for the folder of forged signatures and squared its edges against the table. "And I do so love arithmetic. Thomas, how many hours until the party?" 40, the old attorney said. "Then let her pour the tea," Margaret said. "Let her pour it in front of every gossip in Newport, and let them all be watching when she learns what this old woman's hand can still do." They planned it the way you set a table, carefully and for guests. Thomas Foster would arrive at the party as an ordinary attendee and stay near the terrace doors. Walter would keep the flash drive and a folder of certified copies in the pantry, ready. Daniel would not be seen until the moment was right. But plans are fragile things, and the next morning nearly broke this one. Victoria came down early, restless, and found Walter in the pantry with a folder in his hands. "What are you doing in here?" she said, not quite a question, her eyes sharp as a hawk's over a field. Walter, who had kept 40 years of secrets, did not blink. "Counting the good china for tomorrow, Miss Hayes," he said, and lifted a stack of plates from the shelf as though he had been holding them all along. 40 settings. The Ashfords always want the gold rim. Victoria looked at him a long moment, at the plates, at the closed folder tucked now beneath a stack of linen napkins, and then she smiled her cool, satisfied smile and turned away. Walter did not let out his breath until her heels had faded down the marble hall. It had been that close. And Clara did what she had always done. On the morning of the party she rose before the sun. She polished the silver pot until it threw back the pink dawn. She cut the jasmine, the stem's weeping green sap, onto her fingers. She pressed the good linens until the iron hissed steam. And when Patricia thrust the stained apron at her and told her to serve and stay out of the photographs, Clara said. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, in a voice that did not shake, and only Margaret, watching from her wheelchair by the east window, saw the young woman's steady hands and understood that the tide had turned and was, at that very moment, rushing back in. By 4 o'clock, the terrace of Thornfield House was a white sea of linen and pearls. 40 of the wealthiest families between Newport and Boston sat beneath the striped awning, while gulls wheeled over the cliffs and the smell of jasmine and salt and bergamot hung heavy in the July heat. A string quartet played something bright and forgettable near the balustrade. Patricia moved among the guests, luminous with triumph, a champagne flute sweating in her hand. And at the head of the long table, in a chair of white wicker, sat Margaret Whitmore, small and ancient in pale blue silk, her aching hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright and terribly calm. Victoria Hayes rose to a ripple of applause. She was radiant in ivory, and she lifted the heavy silver pot, and she began to speak, a graceful little speech about family and devotion, and stepping forward to care for a great old house and its great old lady. Steam curled up in a thin ribbon into the golden air. Near the servant's door, in a plain gray dress, Clara Bennett stood very still and watched the tea fall into the delicate porcelain cup. "And so," Victoria said, turning with the cup held out in both hands, lowering herself in a graceful bow before the matriarch, "please, darling Margaret, allow me to pour the first cup as your family from this day on." The terrace hushed. 40 guests leaned in, and the quartet let its last note die into the sea wind. Victoria extended the steaming cup toward the old woman's hands, and Margaret Whitmore's ancient hand moved faster than anyone believed possible. She struck the cup from beneath, one sharp, clean blow, and the porcelain flew from Victoria's fingers and shattered on the terrace stones in a bright spray of hot tea and broken china that rang out across the silent crowd like a bell. "Get out," Margaret said, not loudly. But every soul on that terrace heard it, and the whole gathering flinched as one. "Get out of my house, you thief." Victoria's radiant smile froze, then cracked. "Margaret, darling, you're confused, the heat. I am 80 years old, and I have never been less confused in my life." The matriarch's voice rose, clear and cold as the sea wind. "You forged my name. You emptied the fund my husband built to care for the people who served this family for 40 years. You stole the letters between my grandson and his wife, and you sent lies across the world in her name." A gasp moved through the guests like wind through wheat. His wife, Margaret, repeated, and lifted one trembling finger, and pointed it not at Victoria, but past her, to the plain grey dress by the servants' door. "Clara, come here, child. Come and stand where you have always belonged." The silence was absolute. And then the terrace doors opened. Thomas Foster stepped through first, in his grey summer suit, a certified folder under his arm. "I am the Whitmore family's attorney," he said to the room, "and I can confirm that every word Mrs. Whitmore has spoken is documented, notarized, and, as of 9 o'clock this morning, filed with the county." He set the folder on the table with a soft, final slap of paper on wood. The forged authorizations, the account records, the whole account. "That's a lie," Victoria said. But her voice had thinned, and a bright bead of sweat traced the line of her jaw. "You have no proof I touched a single." The doors opened again, and Walter Cole came through with the flash drive and a small speaker, and without a word he pressed play, and Victoria's own cool voice spilled out over the terrace, tinny and unmistakable. "The little nurse won't say a word." Girls like that are grateful just to be allowed in the room. The color drained from Patricia Whitmore's face until it matched her pearls, and the champagne flute slipped from her fingers and rolled unbroken across the grass. And then the doors opened a third time, and Daniel Whitmore walked out into the July light. He did not look at Victoria. He crossed the terrace in the ringing silence, past his ashen mother, past the shattered cup and the dark stains spreading on the stones. And he stopped before the young woman in the grey dress, and in front of 40 of the wealthiest families in New England, he took both of Clara's hands in his. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke on it. "I came home to say it in front of every person who was here when they made you small. This is my wife. Her name is Clara Whitmore. And there has never, for one single day, been anyone else." Clara Whitmore looked at the shattered porcelain, at the woman in ivory whose face had come apart, at the crowd that had watched her carry trays and stains in silence for 5 months. She could have said 1,000 things. She said only one. "I never wanted anything," she said, quietly, to the whole terrace, except to be believed. And she did not gloat, and she did not weep, and somehow that steady, dignified sentence was louder than any scream. The rest happened with the swift, procedural calm of arithmetic settling accounts. Thomas Foster had, that morning, already turned the forgery records over to the proper authorities. 2 officers, who had been waiting quietly at the gate, came through the garden, their shoes soft on the clipped grass, and Victoria Hayes was escorted from Thornfield House, not in handcuffs and not with any drama, but with a folder of charges and a firm, level voice, reading her the facts of forgery and grand theft. She did not pour any more tea. At the gate she turned once, as if to speak, and found 40 faces looking at her the way one looks at a stain being carried out of a clean room, and she said nothing. And then she was gone. As for Patricia, the recording had caught her too, and Margaret, from her white wicker chair, looked at her son's mother for a long, cold moment, and then said the second thing that Terrace would remember for years. "You are my late son's widow, Patricia, and for his sake you will keep your rooms and your allowance. But you will never again call this house yours, and you will apologize to Clara in front of these people, or you will pack tonight." And Patricia Whitmore, 62 and immaculate and utterly undone, turned to the young woman she had handed an apron, and in a voice that finally shook, said, "I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. It was not forgiveness earned. But it was a beginning, and Clara, who understood better than anyone that mercy is a kind of strength the cruel never expect, inclined her head and accepted it. 3 months later, the first cool breath of autumn came off the Atlantic, and Thornfield House had become a different place. The salt wind still smelled of the sea, but now it carried from the kitchen garden the warm scent of bread and rosemary, and from the terrace laughter that no one had to earn. The forensic audit, when it was finished, confirmed every figure in the blue notebook to the dollar. 142,000 of it recovered and returned. Every cent of it to the caregiving trust for the maids and gardeners whose pensions Victoria had raided. Margaret insisted on adding to it from her own accounts until it was 3 times its former size, and she asked Clara to run it. They named it the Delgado Bennett Fund, and its very first act was to send Rosa Delgado, who had once collected 31 job rejections, to nursing school. All expenses paid, with a standing position waiting at Thornfield for the day she pinned on her cap. Rosa read the letter twice before she understood it, and then she pressed it to her chest and laughed through bright, spilling tears. Then she did the thing she had always done. She brought Clara a warm roll and a cup of good coffee, the way she always had, except that now they drank it together at the long table, in the good light where everyone could see. Walter Cole was made steward of the whole estate, with a raise he tried 3 times to refuse, and finally accepted only when Margaret threatened to double it again. Thomas Foster came to Sunday dinners and pretended to complain about the drive, and Daniel and Clara Whitmore learned, slowly and without any hurry at all, how to be married in the open, how to walk the cliff path at dusk with their hands loosely joined, the long grass whispering at their knees, how to name the sailboats from the east window, while Margaret dozed in the gold light and pretended she wasn't listening. On the wall of that east room, where the morning sun struck it first, they hung a small framed photograph of a stone chapel outside Boston, and 2 young people laughing under a rain of white petals, no longer a secret, but a thing displayed with pride. And on the mantel below it, closed now, its work done, lay a worn blue notebook that had once recorded 2 blue pills at 7 90 of a warm cloth, and had ended up recording the truth that set an entire household free. On a bright Sunday in early autumn, Margaret Whitmore sat at the head of the long table with her family around her, her grandson, her granddaughter-in-law, her steward, her attorney, and a young woman in crisp nursing scrubs, who had once been told no 31 times. She lifted, in her own steady, aching hand, a delicate porcelain cup, and she looked at the gray-blue sea and the wheeling gulls and the people who loved her. And she said, 80 years I've watched the tide go out, and every single time, every time it comes back in. She smiled. Pour the tea, Clara, my dear. Pour it yourself. And so we come, as every honest story must, to the quiet part, the part that is really about us. It is a strange thing, is it not, how the world so often mistakes a soft voice for a small soul, and a servant's dress for a servant's worth. How readily we believe the confident thief and overlook the patient, faithful heart standing quietly by the door. If you have ever been the one made to wait, made to serve, made to keep out of the photographs while someone louder poured the tea, take heart. The truth is patient. It keeps its own ledger in a hand steadier than any forger's, and it does not forget a single kindness done when no one was watching, nor a single cruelty dressed up as grace. As the evening of life approaches, and the silver hair of wisdom settles on us all, we discover that Margaret was right. The rest is just arithmetic. What we carry into the twilight of a long life is not the size of the house or the shine of the silver, but the number of people we lifted when it cost us something to do it. and the number of times we told the truth when a lie would have been easier. Wealth can be forged. A signature can be copied. But no one can counterfeit a faithful heart, and in the end, it is the faithful heart, and not the loudest voice, that the tide always carries home. Be the one who pours the tea with love, and not for show. Be the one who slips the warm roll onto the windowsill. And when the day comes that someone tries to make you small in your own life, stand steady, keep your ledger honest, and wait. Because the truth, like the sea, always comes back in.